In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States did something it had never done before. It took the largest corporation in American history, a company that controlled 90% of all oil refined in the nation, a company worth more than the entire federal budget, a company so powerful that it could make or break entire industries with a single decision, and it tore it apart. Standard Oil was dead, or so everyone thought. Because here's the thing about John D. Rockefeller, the man who built that empire from nothing. When the Supreme Court shattered his monopoly into 34 separate companies, they didn't destroy his wealth. They multiplied it. Within just a few years, those 34 pieces would become worth far more than the original whole. Companies you've heard of: ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP America, they're all children of Standard Oil. And Rockefeller, who owned significant stakes in all of them, became richer than ever before. At the peak of his power, adjusted for inflation, John D. Rockefeller was worth over $400 billion. To put that in perspective, that's roughly double what Elon Musk is worth today. Some economists estimate he controlled between 1 and 2% of the entire American economy. One man, 1% of everything. He was called a robber baron, a monster, a man who crushed competitors like insects beneath his heel. Ida Tarbell, the muckraking journalist who spent years investigating him, said he had the face of a man who knew no mercy. Political cartoons depicted him as an octopus, his tentacles wrapped around the Capitol building, around oil derricks, around the throats of ordinary Americans. And yet, this same man gave away over $500 million during his lifetime, the equivalent of about $10 billion today. He funded the University of Chicago. He created the Rockefeller Foundation, which helped eliminate hookworm in the American South and yellow fever across the globe. His medical research initiatives would eventually contribute to the development of the polio vaccine. So which was he? Villain or saint? Destroyer or creator? The man who corrupted American democracy, or the philanthropist who transformed it? The answer, as you might expect, is complicated. But to understand John D. Rockefeller, to truly understand the most powerful businessman who ever lived, you need to start at the beginning. And the beginning, like so much else in the story, involves a con man. William Avery Rockefeller was what people in the 19th century politely called a confidence man. Less politely, he was a fraud, a bigamist, and quite possibly a rapist. He was also John D. Rockefeller's father. Known to locals as Devil Bill, William Rockefeller was a tall, charismatic man with a booming voice and an absolute absence of moral principle. He traveled through rural New York and Pennsylvania selling patent medicines, bottles of worthless liquid that he claimed could cure cancer. Dr. William Rockefeller, celebrated cancer specialist, read his business cards. Though he had no medical training whatsoever, he charged $25 for his treatments, an enormous sum at the time, and when his cures inevitably failed, he was long gone. He was rarely home. He would disappear for months at a time, returning without explanation, his pocket stuffed with cash from whatever scheme he'd been running. He kept a second family in another state, a woman named Margaret Allen, whom he married under a false name while still legally wed to John's mother. He was, in every way that mattered, a spectacular failure as a father and as a human being. But here's where the story gets interesting. Devil Bill believed in education. Not formal education, exactly, but practical education. He would loan his children money and charge them interest. He would make deals with them for chores, then try to cheat them out of the payment, teaching them to watch every transaction with suspicion. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," he once bragged to a neighbor. "I want to make them sharp." John D. Rockefeller, born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, was paying close attention. While his father represented chaos and dishonesty, his mother, Liza Davison Rockefeller, represented the opposite. She was a devout Baptist, stern and disciplined, the kind of woman who believed that waste was a sin, and that God rewarded the righteous with prosperity. She held the family together during William's long absences, stretching every penny, instilling in her children a religious devotion that John would carry for the rest of his life. From his mother, Rockefeller learned frugality, order, and the conviction that wealth was a sign of divine favor. From his father, He learned how the world actually worked, that people could be manipulated, that business was a game with flexible rules, and that the difference between a respectable businessman and a con man was often just a matter of scale and legality. John absorbed both lessons completely. As a child, he was quiet, serious, and watchful. He didn't play much with other children. Instead, he would spend hours counting and recounting the money he had saved, recording every transaction in a small notebook. He raised turkeys and sold them. He lent money to local farmers at 7% interest. By the time he was 12, he had saved $50, a small fortune for a farm boy, and he loaned it to a neighboring farmer who needed help with his harvest. The interest John earned on that loan came to $3.5. Years later, Rockefeller would recall this moment as a revelation. The impression was gaining ground with me, he wrote, that it was a good thing to let the money be my servant and not make myself a slave to money. He wasn't yet a teenager, and he had already discovered the fundamental truth of capitalism. Money makes money. Labor has limits. You can only work so many hours in a day, lift so many bales, dig so many ditches. But capital works around the clock. Capital multiplies in your sleep. Capital is infinite. This realization would shape everything that followed. The Rockefeller family moved frequently during John's childhood, always one step ahead of Devil Bill's various scandals. From Richford, they moved to Moravia, then to Owego, and finally, in 1853, to the booming city of Cleveland, Ohio. John was 14 years old. Cleveland was a revelation. Situated on the southern shore of Lake Erie, at the intersection of major railroad lines and canal routes, it was rapidly becoming one of America's commercial hubs. Goods flowed through the city in every direction: lumber, grain, iron, coal. Fortunes were being made by men who knew how to move things from one place to another at the right price. John enrolled at Central High School, but his real education happened elsewhere. He spent every spare moment wandering the docks and warehouses, watching how business was conducted, memorizing the prices of commodities, calculating profit margins in his head. He was obsessed with the mechanics of commerce in a way that other teenagers are obsessed with sports or girls or adventure novels. At 16, he decided that school was a waste of time. He had learned everything formal education could teach him. What he needed now was a job position where he could learn the practical side of business from the inside. He enrolled in a 3-month commercial course to learn double-entry bookkeeping, and then he hit the streets of Cleveland, applying to every trading house, shipping firm, and commission merchant in the city. For 6 weeks, he walked from door to door, presenting himself to merchants, asking for work. He was rejected again and again. But Rockefeller didn't get discouraged. He simply went back to the same businesses and applied again and again. He later called this period my apprenticeship, not as a businessman, but as someone who understood rejection and persisted anyway. On September 26, 1855, a small commission firm called Hewitt and Tuttle finally gave him a job as an assistant bookkeeper. The salary was pathetic, about 50 cents a day, far less than a manual laborer would earn. But John didn't care about the money. He cared about the opportunity. He later called September 26th Job Day, and he celebrated it every year for the rest of his life, more religiously, some observers noted, than he celebrated his own birthday. This was the day his real life began. At Hewitt and Tuttle, Rockefeller proved himself invaluable almost immediately. He arrived before anyone else and stayed later than everyone. He checked and rechecked every figure, every invoice, every receipt. He caught errors that others had missed. He found inefficiencies in the firm's operations and suggested improvements. Within months, he had essentially taken over the bookkeeping operation. But he wasn't just doing his job. He was learning. He watched how the partners negotiated with suppliers. He studied the flow of goods through Cleveland's transportation networks. He analyzed which trades were profitable and which weren't. And more importantly, he figured out why. He noticed that the merchants who made the most money weren't necessarily the ones who worked the hardest or took the biggest risks. They were the ones who controlled information, who knew what goods were scarce before anyone else, who could anticipate shifts in supply and demand. Information, he realized, was power, and power was money. He also learned something about his own psychology during these years. Other young men in his position might have been tempted to spend their wages on entertainment, on clothes, on the social life of a growing city. John Rockefeller had no interest in any of it. He found the act of saving money, of watching his account grow, more satisfying than anything money could buy. Thrift wasn't a sacrifice for him. It was a pleasure. His one indulgence was the Baptist Church. Every Sunday, he attended services at the Erie Street Baptist Church, where he taught Sunday school, served as a trustee, and donated a significant portion of his meager salary. Religion wasn't separate from his business life, it was intertwined with it. The same discipline, the same order, the same faith in systems and rules that made him an excellent bookkeeper also made him a devout Christian. Both offered structure, both rewarded diligence, both promised that righteous behavior would be repaid. He never questioned whether these beliefs might contradict each other. Perhaps it never occurred to him that they could. By 1858, when he was just 18 years old, Rockefeller had saved enough money to make his move. He left Hewitt and Tuttle and formed a partnership with Maurice Clark, a fellow church member and commission merchant. The firm of Clark and Rockefeller opened for business on the Cleveland docks, trading in grain, hay, meats, and miscellaneous goods. The timing couldn't have been better. Within 3 years, the country would be at war, and the Union Army would need supplies. Vast quantities of supplies shipped to the front as quickly as possible. Commission merchants who could move goods efficiently would become very rich very fast. But the Civil War would bring something else to Ohio, something that would transform John D. Rockefeller from a successful merchant into the most powerful businessman on earth. In the hills of western Pennsylvania, just a few hundred miles from Cleveland, men were about to punch holes in the ground and change history. They were drilling for oil. Here's what you need to understand about oil in the mid-19th century. Nobody knew what to do with it. For centuries, petroleum had been known to exist. Native Americans had collected it from natural seeps and used it for medicine and waterproofing. Early settlers in Pennsylvania noticed that a foul-smelling black substance sometimes contaminated their salt wells. It was considered a nuisance, a worthless byproduct, something to be avoided. Then, in the 1850s, a few entrepreneurs started to wonder if the strange liquid might actually be useful. George Bissell, a New York lawyer, sent a sample of Pennsylvania rock oil to a Yale chemistry professor named Benjamin Silliman, Jr.B. Silliman's report, delivered in 1855, was revolutionary. He found that petroleum could be refined into a variety of products, including an excellent illuminating oil that burned cleaner and brighter than the whale oil currently lighting American homes. This was huge. Whale oil was expensive, and whale populations were collapsing from overhunting. The world needed a new source of light. If petroleum could provide it, there was a fortune to be made. But first, someone had to figure out how to get the oil out of the ground in commercial quantities. On August 27, 1859, a retired railroad conductor named Edwin Drake succeeded where everyone else had failed. Using a steam engine and a drilling rig designed for salt wells, he struck oil at a depth of 69 feet near the town of Titusville, Pennsylvania. The well produced about 25 barrels a day, not much by later standards, but enough to prove that commercial oil production was possible. The news spread like wildfire. Within months, thousands of fortune seekers descended on northwestern Pennsylvania. Farmers sold drilling rights to their land. Speculators bought and sold leases at dizzying prices. Towns sprang up overnight: Oil City, Petroleum Center, Pithole, only to be abandoned just as quickly when the wells ran dry. It was chaos, pure and absolute, a gold rush in miniature, with all the greed and disorder and desperation that implies. The Pennsylvania oil fields in 1860 were something out of a fever dream. Imagine thousands of wooden derricks crowded so closely together that you could leap from one platform to the next. Imagine rivers of mud churned by wagon wheels, the roads so destroyed that horses drowned in the muck. Imagine crude oil flowing through open ditches, pooling in ponds, seeping into creeks until the water itself became flammable. Imagine the constant thunder of steam engines, the shouts of teamsters, the prayers of speculators watching drill bits descend into the earth. and imagine the fires. Oil soaked into everything, into the wooden buildings, into the derricks, into the clothing of the workers. A single spark could ignite an inferno. Towns burned to the ground with terrifying regularity. Men died in explosions, in collapsing wells, in brawls over disputed claims. The oil regions were wild, lawless, and extraordinarily dangerous. They were also extraordinarily profitable if you knew what you were doing. The problem was that most people didn't know what they were doing. The men who rushed to Pennsylvania were gamblers, not businessmen. They understood drilling, or at least they thought they did. But they didn't understand markets. They didn't understand that a barrel of crude oil was worthless until it was refined. They didn't understand that the real money wasn't in pulling oil from the ground, it was in controlling what happened to that oil afterward. John D. Rockefeller understood. From his office in Cleveland, Rockefeller watched the chaos in Pennsylvania with the cold, calculating eye of a chess master studying the board. He saw fortunes made and lost in the oil fields with dizzying speed. He saw producers drilling wells as fast as they could, flooding the market with crude, driving prices down until they were practically giving the stuff away. He saw refineries spring up everywhere in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in New York, and especially in Cleveland, all competing desperately for the same oil, the same customers, the same slim margins. He saw disorder, he saw waste, he saw opportunity, but he didn't rush in. That wasn't Rockefeller's way. He waited, he watched, he gathered information, he calculated, and then, in 1863, he made his move. The first rule of Rockefeller's business philosophy was this: never risk what you can't afford to lose. He didn't gamble on drilling. Drilling was for fools and dreamers, men willing to bet everything on the chance that there might be oil beneath their feet. Instead, Rockefeller focused on refining the process of turning worthless crude into valuable products. Refineries required capital and expertise, but they didn't require luck. A well-run refinery would make money regardless of whether any individual well struck oil or came up dry. It was the difference between being a gold miner and being the man who sells pickaxes to gold miners. One of them might get rich, the other definitely will. In 1863, a Cleveland chemist and engineer named Samuel Andrews approached Rockefeller with the proposition. Andrews had developed a superior refining process that produced more kerosene from each barrel of crude while generating less waste. He had the technical knowledge. What he lacked was capital and business acumen. Rockefeller, who had both in abundance, saw the potential immediately. Together with Maurice Clark and his brothers, they formed Andrews, Clark and Company and built a refinery on the banks of Kingsbury Run, a creek that flowed into the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. It was a modest operation at first, just a few stills, some storage tanks, a handful of workers. But from the very beginning, Rockefeller ran it differently than anyone else ran their refineries. He obsessed over efficiency. Every barrel of crude that came through the doors was tracked, measured, and accounted for. Every drop of kerosene that left the facility was similarly documented. He studied the refining process with the same intensity he had once applied to bookkeeping, looking for places where waste could be eliminated, where procedures could be improved, where pennies could be saved. And the pennies added up. While other refiners were content to throw away the byproducts of the refining process, the tar, the naphtha, the gasoline, Rockefeller found uses for them. The tar could be sold to road builders. The naphtha could be used as a solvent. Even the gasoline, which was considered a useless and dangerous waste product at the time, could be sold to manufacturers for cleaning. Nothing was wasted. Everything was monetized. His competitors laughed at him. They called him a penny pincher, small thinker, a man so focused on saving nickels that he couldn't see the big picture. They were drilling more wells, building bigger refineries, expanding as fast as credit would allow. Rockefeller kept saving his pennies, and he kept watching. By 1865, the refinery on Kingsbury Run was one of the largest in Cleveland, processing over 500 barrels of crude oil per day. The partnership with the Clark brothers, however, was becoming strained. Maurice Clark was cautious and conservative. and willing to take on the debt necessary to expand further. Rockefeller saw the refining industry consolidating rapidly and believed that only the largest, most efficient operations would survive. They needed to grow or be swallowed. The conflict came to a head in February 1865. At a partnership meeting, the disagreement over expansion became so heated that Rockefeller suggested they simply dissolve the partnership and auction off the business to the highest bidder among themselves. The Clark brothers agreed, probably thinking that Rockefeller, who was only 25 years old, couldn't possibly outbid them. They were wrong. The auction took place on February 2, 1865. Bidding started at $500 and escalated quickly. Clark bid $72,500. Rockefeller bid $72,500 and $100. Back and forth they went, the numbers climbing higher and higher, far beyond what anyone had expected. The atmosphere grew tense. The other partners watched in disbelief as the price passed $100,000. Finally, at $72,500, Maurice Clark paused and looked at his young partner. "I'll go no higher, John," he said. "The business is mine," Rockefeller replied. He had paid an enormous sum for more than the refinery was worth on paper. But Rockefeller understood something that the Clarks didn't. The refinery wasn't just a business. It was a foothold in an industry that was about to explode. Whoever controlled refining capacity in a major hub like Cleveland would have enormous power over the entire oil trade. Walking home that night, Rockefeller later recalled, he felt elated in a way he rarely allowed himself. "It was the day that determined my career," he would say. "I felt the bigness of it, but I was as calm as I am talking to you now." This was the birth of what would become Standard Oil. Though the name wouldn't come for another 5 years, the philosophy was already fully formed in Rockefeller's mind: dominate the industry, control the chaos, and eliminate the waste of competition. The years immediately following the Civil War were transformative for the oil industry and for John D. Rockefeller. With the war over, the American economy was expanding at an unprecedented rate. Railroads were pushing westward, factories were multiplying, cities were growing, and all of it needed light. Kerosene lamps were replacing candles in homes across the country and around the world. The demand for refined petroleum products seemed limitless. But supply was growing even faster than demand. The oil fields of Pennsylvania kept producing, and new fields were being discovered in West Virginia and Ohio. Refineries proliferated like mushrooms after rain. By 1870, the refining industry was in a state of chronic overcapacity, too many refineries chasing too few customers, prices falling, profit margins shrinking to nothing. For most refiners, this was a disaster. For Rockefeller, it was exactly what he had been waiting for. He understood, with the clarity that bordered on prophetic, that the industry was headed for a reckoning. The small operators, the inefficient producers, the undercapitalized dreamers, they would be crushed by falling prices. Only the strongest, the most efficient, the most ruthlessly disciplined would survive. And he intended to be not just among the survivors, but the sole survivor standing atop the wreckage. In 1866 and 1867, Rockefeller built a second refinery in Cleveland, the Standard Works, which quickly became the largest in the city. He brought in his brother William as a partner and established a New York office to handle sales and exports. He recruited Henry Flagler, a clever and aggressive businessman who shared Rockefeller's vision of industry consolidation, offering him a partnership in exchange for his expertise in transportation and logistics. Flagler proved to be the perfect complement to Rockefeller's temperament. Where Rockefeller was cold, methodical, and patient, Flagler was bold, imaginative, and willing to push boundaries. Together, they made a formidable team: the strategist and the tactician, the planner and the executor. One of Flagler's first contributions was to negotiate a secret deal with the Lakeshore Railroad, the major carrier of oil from the Pennsylvania fields to Cleveland. In exchange for guaranteeing a large and steady volume of shipments, the railroad agreed to give Rockefeller's refineries a substantial discount on freight rates, a discount that was not available to his competitors. This was the first of many such arrangements, and it would become one of the most controversial aspects of Rockefeller's business practices. The railroad rebates, as they came to be known, gave Standard Oil an enormous competitive advantage. By paying less to transport their crude oil and refined products, Rockefeller could undercut his rivals on price while still maintaining healthy profits. Competitors who had no such arrangements were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Was it legal? Technically, yes. At the time, there were no laws prohibiting railroads from offering preferential rates to large customers. Was it fair? That was another question entirely. Rockefeller never saw anything wrong with it. Who can buy beef the cheapest? He would later ask. The housewife for her family, the steward for a club or hotel, or the commissary for an army. Who can buy cotton the cheapest, the small manufacturer or the large one? Volume discounts, he argued, were simply good business. He was offering the railroads guaranteed traffic in an industry plagued by uncertainty. They were offering him lower rates in return. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. His competitors saw it differently. They saw a conspiracy between the railroads and the largest refiners to drive everyone else out of business. And in a sense, they were right. That was exactly what was happening. On January 10, 1870, John D. Rockefeller, his brother William, Henry Flagler, Samuel Andrews, and Stephen Harkness, a silent partner who provided crucial capital, incorporated a new company under the laws of Ohio. They called it the Standard Oil Company. The name was carefully chosen. Standard implied quality, consistency, reliability, a product you could trust. In an era when kerosene quality varied wildly from producer to producer, when barrels might contain impurities that caused lamps to smoke or even explode, Standard Oil promised a uniform product that met a consistent standard. It was as much a marketing statement as a corporate identity. The company was capitalized at $1 million, an enormous sum for the time, with Rockefeller holding the largest stake. At just 30 years old, he was now the head of the largest oil refining operation in the world, with facilities capable of processing over 1,500 barrels of crude per day. But for Rockefeller, this was just the beginning. He looked at the American oil industry and saw chaos everywhere. In the oil fields, thousands of independent producers were pumping crude as fast as they could, driving prices into the ground. In the refining sector, hundreds of small operators were barely scraping by, their facilities outdated, their processes wasteful, their futures precarious. In transportation, railroads were competing fiercely for oil traffic, building parallel lines, cutting rates, destabilizing the entire system. All of this competition, Rockefeller believed, was destroying value rather than creating it. Prices swung wildly, making planning impossible. Overproduction led to gluts, followed by shortages, followed by more overproduction. Refiners built capacity they couldn't use. Railroads built lines they couldn't fill. Millions of dollars were being wasted on redundant infrastructure, duplicated effort, and cutthroat competition that benefited no one. What the industry needed, in Rockefeller's view, was order, consolidation, central planning by a single rational actor who could balance supply and demand, coordinate production and transportation, eliminate waste, and maximize efficiency. The chaos of the free market was the problem. Monopoly was the solution. This was not a cynical rationalization. Rockefeller genuinely believed, and would believe for the rest of his life, that he was doing good by eliminating competition. The day of combination is here to stay, he would later say. Individualism has gone, never to return. The great trusts and monopolies that he and others were building were not aberrations, but natural developments, the inevitable evolution of American capitalism toward greater efficiency and rationality. The fact that this evolution also made him fantastically wealthy was, in his mind, simply proof that God approved of his methods. The first phase of Standard Oil's consolidation strategy began in Cleveland itself. In 1870, Cleveland was home to roughly 30 oil refineries, most of them small, undercapitalized operations struggling to survive in an increasingly competitive market. Rockefeller knew every one of them, their owners, their capacities, their financial situations. He had studied them with the same thoroughness he applied to everything else. Starting in early 1871, he began approaching his competitors with a simple proposition: sell to Standard Oil, or be destroyed. He didn't put it quite that bluntly, of course. Rockefeller was always polite, always reasonable, always willing to offer what seemed like fair terms. He would invite a refinery owner to his office, show him the books, explain Standard Oil's advantages in transportation costs and economies of scale. He would point out, gently but firmly, that a small independent refiner simply could not compete against such advantages in the long run. The smart move, the only sensible move, was to sell now, while the business was still worth something, and then he would make his offer. Typically, he offered to buy refineries for cash, or for Standard Oil stock, or for some combination of the two. The valuations were low, often well below what the owners thought their businesses were worth, but Rockefeller was skilled at convincing them that his assessment was the accurate one. He had access to information they didn't have. He knew their costs, their debts, their vulnerabilities. He knew how to apply pressure. Most importantly, he knew that time was on his side. Every month that passed, Standard Oil grew stronger and its competitors grew weaker. Falling prices squeezed profit margins. Transportation disadvantages accumulated. Banks grew nervous about lending to small refiners whose futures were uncertain. The longer an owner waited, the worse his bargaining position became. And so they sold. One by one, Cleveland's independent refiners capitulated. Some took cash and walked away. Others accepted Standard Oil stock and became shareholders in the very company that had absorbed them. A few tried to hold out, believing they could weather the storm. They couldn't. The winter of 1872 was the bloodiest in the history of American oil. Not literally bloody, there were no murders, no riots, no physical violence. But what happened in Cleveland during those cold February and March weeks was a massacre nonetheless. In the space of just 6 weeks, John D. Rockefeller acquired 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland. By the time spring arrived, Standard Oil controlled virtually all of the refining capacity in America's most important oil hub. The independent refiners of Cleveland didn't just lose their businesses. Many of them lost everything: their savings, their reputations, their sense of themselves as self-made men in control of their own destinies. Some would never recover. Others would spend the rest of their lives consumed by bitterness, convinced that they had been cheated by a man who played by different rules than everyone else. And in a sense, they were right. To understand what happened in Cleveland, you need to understand the South Improvement Company, one of the most audacious and controversial schemes in American business history. The South Improvement Company was not, despite its name, a company designed to improve the South or anything else. It was a cartel, a secret agreement between the largest oil refiners and the major railroads to fix prices, divide markets, and crush competition. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and cynicism. Here's how it worked. The participating railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, and the Erie, would dramatically increase their published freight rates for oil shipments. These higher rates would apply to everyone, but members of the South Improvement Company would receive massive rebates on their own shipments, effectively paying far less than the published rates. Even more remarkably, they would also receive drawbacks payments from the railroads based on their competitors' shipments. Every barrel of oil that a non-member shipped would put money directly into the pockets of the cartel members. It was, in effect, a scheme to make independent refiners pay for their own destruction. The South Improvement Company was incorporated in Pennsylvania in 1871, and Standard Oil was its largest member. Rockefeller didn't create the scheme. That honor probably belongs to Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but he embraced it enthusiastically. If it worked, it would give Standard Oil an insurmountable advantage over every competitor in the country. If it didn't work, well, he had other plans. In February 1872, the railroads announced their new rate schedules. Freight rates for oil shipments would more than double overnight. For the independent refiners of Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and the oil regions, it was a death sentence. They simply couldn't afford to pay rates that high. They would be driven out of business within months. But before the new rates could take effect, someone talked. News of the South Improvement Company leaked to the press in late February. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The oil producers of Pennsylvania, already suspicious of the railroads and the large refiners, erupted in fury. Mass meetings were held in Titusville, Oil City, and other towns. Effigies of Rockefeller and the other conspirators were burned. The Petroleum Producers Union organized a boycott, refusing to sell crude oil to any refiner associated with the South Improvement Company. For a few weeks, it looked like the conspiracy might actually fail. The public outcry was too intense. Politicians began investigating. The railroads, facing the prospect of a complete shutdown of oil traffic, backed down. By April 1872, the South Improvement Company was dead, its charter revoked by the Pennsylvania legislature. But here's the thing. By the time the South Improvement Company collapsed, Rockefeller had already used it to conquer Cleveland. During those 6 weeks in February and March, while the conspiracy was still secret, Rockefeller moved with ruthless efficiency. He visited his competitors one by one, explaining the new reality. "Look at these freight rates," he told them. "Look at what you'll have to pay to ship your oil. You can't survive this. You know you can't. Sell to me now, while your business is still worth something. Take Standard Oil stock. Become part of something bigger, or watch everything you've built be destroyed." The pressure was enormous. The refiners could see the numbers as clearly as Rockefeller could. Under the new rates, their businesses were worthless. Many of them had borrowed heavily to build their refineries, and now, they faced not just bankruptcy, but personal ruin. Rockefeller offered them a way out, not a good way, but better than nothing. Some tried to resist. Frank Rockefeller, John's own brother, who ran a competing refinery, was among them. "We will never sell," Frank reportedly told John during one heated meeting. "You're trying to ruin us." John remained calm, as he always did. "I'm trying to save you," he replied, "from yourself." In the end, Frank sold too. Nearly everyone sold. Of the 26 independent refineries in Cleveland at the start of 1872, only 4 remained independent. By April, Standard Oil's refining capacity had more than tripled. The company now controlled approximately a quarter of all refining capacity in the United States. And although the South Improvement Company was gone, the lesson it taught was permanent. Rockefeller had learned that the threat of railroad discrimination was almost as effective as the reality. He had also learned that he didn't need a formal cartel to achieve his goals. He could accomplish the same thing through bilateral agreements with the railroads, quieter, less visible, harder to attack. The Cleveland Massacre, as it came to be known, established the pattern that Standard Oil would follow for the next decade. Approach competitors quietly, offer to buy them out at prices that seemed fair, or at least fair enough. Make clear, without ever quite saying so explicitly, that the alternative was destruction. Absorb the willing, crush the defiant. It was not a pleasant business. Even Rockefeller seemed to recognize this. "It was forced upon us," he would later say of the consolidation. "We had to do it in self-defense." In his telling, Standard Oil was not the aggressor, but the victim, a company simply trying to bring order to a chaotic industry. Opposed at every turn by small-minded men who couldn't see the bigger picture. Whether you believe this depends on how you feel about the men who lost their businesses, their livelihoods, and their dreams in the face of Rockefeller's relentless advance. Among those men was a woman named Ida Tarbell. Actually, Ida Tarbell was just a girl in 1872, 14 years old, living with her family in Titusville, in the heart of the Pennsylvania oil regions. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, was a small oil producer and tank manufacturer who had struggled for years to build a business in the volatile petroleum trade. Ida never forgot the day the South Improvement Company was announced. She remembered her father coming home from a meeting, his face gray with shock and anger. She remembered the fear in her mother's voice. She remembered the sense that something monstrous was happening, that powerful forces beyond their control were about to destroy everything her family had worked for. Franklin Tarbell survived the immediate crisis. The South Improvement Company collapsed before it could fully take effect, but the larger threat remained. Over the years that followed, he watched as Standard Oil systematically absorbed or destroyed the independent operators of the oil regions. He watched as the railroads granted preferential rates to Rockefeller's company while charging him full price. He watched as pipelines controlled by Standard Oil refused to carry his crude or charged extortionate fees to do so. He survived, barely. But the bitterness never faded. Ida Tarbell absorbed that bitterness along with everything else. She grew up hating Standard Oil and everything it represented. Decades later, as one of America's most celebrated journalists, she would channel that hatred into a 19-part series for McClure's magazine that remains one of the most devastating works of investigative journalism ever published, but that was still far in the future. In 1872, John D. Rockefeller was just getting started. With Cleveland secure, Rockefeller turned his attention to the rest of the country. The American oil industry in the early 1870s was still remarkably fragmented. Cleveland was the largest refining center, but significant capacity also existed in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, and the oil regions themselves. These scattered operations competed fiercely with one another, driving down prices and preventing any single player from dominating the market. Rockefeller intended to change that. His strategy was methodical, almost scientific. First, he gathered intelligence. Standard Oil's agents fanned out across the country, visiting refineries, talking to owners, assessing capacities and financial conditions. They compiled detailed reports on every significant operation, who owned it, how much it could process, what it cost to run, how much debt it carried. This information flowed back to Cleveland, where Rockefeller and his partners analyzed it with the same care they applied to their own operations. Then came the approaches. Sometimes Rockefeller made them himself, traveling to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or New York to meet with refinery owners personally. More often, he sent trusted lieutenants Henry Flagler, John Archbold, Daniel O'Day to make the initial contact. The pitch was always the same: join us or be destroyed. Some owners welcomed the opportunity. The oil business was exhausting, uncertain, and increasingly unprofitable. Standard Oil offered stability, guaranteed markets, and the chance to share in the profits of a much larger enterprise. Many independent refiners took the deal gladly, exchanging the headaches of running their own businesses for the security of a salary and the value of Standard Oil stock. Others resisted. They valued their independence, distrusted Rockefeller's motives, or simply refused to believe that one company could truly dominate such a vast and competitive industry. These men found themselves facing a coordinated assault on multiple fronts. First, there was the freight advantage. Standard Oil's secret agreements with the railroads meant that competitors paid significantly more to transport their crude and their products. This alone could be enough to destroy a refiner's profit margin. Second, there was the price war. When a competitor refused to sell, Standard Oil would often slash prices in that specific market, sometimes below cost, until the rival was driven out of business. Once the competition was eliminated, prices would conveniently return to normal. The company could afford these losses because they were subsidized by profits from markets where Standard Oil faced no competition. Third, there was the pipeline squeeze. By the mid-1870s, Standard Oil was rapidly acquiring control of the pipeline networks that carried crude oil from the wells to the refineries. Competitors who relied on these pipelines found themselves facing delays, denials of service, or rates so high that they couldn't afford to operate. Building alternative pipelines was theoretically possible, but enormously expensive, and Standard Oil was not above using legal maneuvers, land purchases, and political influence to block such projects. Fourth, there was the supply squeeze. Standard Oil purchased crude oil in such enormous quantities that it could sometimes corner the market, buying up available supply before competitors could acquire it. Refiners who couldn't get crude oil couldn't refine anything. These tactics were not applied haphazardly. They were coordinated and strategic, designed to maximize pressure while minimizing Standard Oil's own costs. Rockefeller thought of it as a military campaign, and in a sense, it was a war of attrition against dozens of smaller enemies who had no chance of winning, but often didn't realize it until it was too late. By 1877, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all refining capacity in the United States. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. In the space of just 7 years, a single company had achieved almost total dominance over one of the nation's most important industries. There was essentially no refining competition left. A handful of small independents survived on the margins, but they posed no threat. Every barrel of kerosene that lit an American home, every gallon of lubricating oil that kept American machinery running, flowed through Standard Oil's facilities, and Rockefeller wasn't finished. The same year that Standard Oil completed its conquest of refining, the company began building the first long-distance oil pipeline in history. Previous pipelines had been short affairs, running from wells to local storage facilities or rail terminals. Standard Oil's pipeline would stretch from the oil regions of Pennsylvania all the way to refineries in Cleveland and beyond, a distance of hundreds of miles. The railroads were terrified. Oil had been one of their most profitable cargoes, and now Rockefeller was threatening to bypass them entirely. They slashed their rates, offered new concessions, did everything they could to keep Standard Oil's business. But Rockefeller was done depending on the railroads. He had seen how unreliable they could be, how they played refiners against each other, how they could be swayed by political pressure. With his own pipeline network, he would control his own destiny. The pipeline project was technically audacious and financially staggering. It required laying hundreds of miles of iron pipe across mountains, rivers, and private property. It required building pumping stations to push the oil uphill. It required legal battles against landowners who didn't want pipelines crossing their farms and railroads who saw the project as an existential threat. Standard Oil prevailed, as it always did. By the early 1880s, the company controlled most of the nation's pipeline infrastructure, adding another layer of dominance to its already formidable position. How did one company achieve such total control? How did John D. Rockefeller accomplish what no American businessman had ever accomplished before? The answer has many parts, and historians have been arguing about their relative importance for over a century. But a few factors stand out. First, there was Rockefeller's genuine superiority as a businessman. Standard Oil really was more efficient than its competitors. Its refineries extracted more product from each barrel of crude. Its logistics operations moved oil more cheaply. Its financial management was more disciplined. Even without the railroad rebates, even without the hardball tactics, Standard Oil would probably have been the most successful refiner in the country. Whether it could have achieved 90% market share through efficiency alone is doubtful, but the efficiency was real. Second, there was the structure of the industry itself. Oil refining in the 1870s was plagued by chronic overcapacity. Too many refineries were chasing too little crude oil, driving prices down and margins to nothing. In such an environment, consolidation was almost inevitable. Someone was going to buy up the weak players and rationalize the industry. Rockefeller simply did it faster and more completely than anyone else could have. Third, there were the secret agreements, the rebates, the drawbacks, the preferential pipeline access. These gave Standard Oil advantages that competitors simply could not match, no matter how efficiently they operated. Whether you call this smart business or unfair competition depends on your perspective, but there's no question that it accelerated Standard Oil's rise dramatically. Fourth, there was the political environment. The Gilded Age was a time of minimal government regulation, weak antitrust enforcement, and pervasive corruption. Politicians could be bought, judges could be influenced, and regulatory agencies barely existed. Standard Oil exploited this environment masterfully, using its wealth to shape laws and policies in its favor. And fifth, there was Rockefeller himself, his patience, his discipline, his absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. He never wavered, never doubted, never let moral qualms or public criticism distract him from his objectives. He was, in his own way, a true believer, convinced that the consolidation of American industry was not only good for him, but good for the country, and indeed for civilization itself. The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest, he he would later say. The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which bring cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it. This is not an evil tendency in business. It is merely the working out of a law of nature and a law of God. The competitors who were sacrificed like those early buds might have disagreed. By 1879, John D. Rockefeller had a problem. It was a good problem, as problems go, the kind of problem that comes from being too successful. Standard Oil had grown so large, so complex, so geographically dispersed that the existing corporate structure could no longer contain it. The company owned refineries in a dozen states, pipelines stretching thousands of miles, storage facilities, shipping operations, and a growing network of wholesale and retail distribution. It employed thousands of workers and generated profits measured in the tens of millions of dollars annually. But legally, Standard Oil was still just an Ohio corporation, and under Ohio law, a corporation chartered in one state could not own property or conduct business in another state without special permission. The company's sprawling empire was held together by a patchwork of informal agreements, interlocking directorates, and gentlemen's understandings. It worked, more or less, but it was messy, inefficient, and potentially vulnerable to legal challenge. Rockefeller needed a new structure, something that could unify his scattered holdings under a single management while maintaining the legal fiction of separate corporate entities. Something flexible enough to accommodate future growth. Something, ideally, that would be difficult for regulators and competitors to understand or attack. The solution came from Samuel Dodd, Standard Oil's chief legal counsel. Dodd was a brilliant corporate lawyer, and in 1882, he devised a mechanism that would revolutionize American business: the trust. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. The stockholders of Standard Oil and its various affiliated companies would transfer their shares to a board of 9 trustees. In exchange, they would receive trust certificates entitling them to a proportional share of the combined enterprise's profits. The trustees Rockefeller, Flagler, and 7 other Standard Oil executives would hold legal title to all the shares and would manage all the companies as a single coordinated entity. The individual companies would continue to exist on paper. They would file separate tax returns, maintain separate corporate officers, and comply with the laws of their respective states. But in reality, they would all be controlled by the same 9 men, operating according to the same central plan, pursuing the same corporate objectives. It was, in effect, a single company disguised as dozens of separate companies. And because the trust was not technically a corporation, it was not subject to the laws that regulated corporations. On January 2, 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was formally established. It brought together 41 companies with combined assets of over $70 million. Rockefeller held the largest stake, controlling approximately 1/3 of the trust certificates. The other trustees were his hand-picked lieutenants, men who had proven their loyalty and competence over years of ruthless competition. The trust agreement was kept secret. Outsiders knew that Standard Oil was a powerful company, but they had no idea how powerful or how it was actually organized. The web of subsidiaries and affiliates was deliberately confusing, designed to obscure the true extent of Rockefeller's control. When investigators or journalists tried to trace the connections, they found themselves lost in a maze of holding companies, paper corporations, and legal fictions. This opacity was intentional. Rockefeller understood that visibility brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought trouble. Better to operate in the shadows, making decisions quietly, avoiding the kind of public attention that might provoke a political response. For a while, it worked. The Standard Oil Trust functioned like a well-oiled machine, pun very much intended, generating enormous profits, while maintaining the appearance of a loosely connected group of independent companies. Rockefeller and his trustees met regularly at the trust's headquarters at 26 Broadway in New York, reviewing operations, setting strategy, and dividing the spoils. But secrets have a way of getting out, and when this particular secret emerged, it would change America forever. To understand how Standard Oil actually operated during the trust years, you need to understand the man at the center of it all. By the early 1880s, John D. Rockefeller was in his early 40s and at the absolute peak of his powers. He had transformed himself from a Cleveland bookkeeper into the most powerful businessman in the world. His wealth was already legendary. Estimates suggested he was worth at least $100 million, making him one of the richest men who had ever lived. His company dominated not just refining but transportation, marketing, and increasingly, the production of crude oil itself. And yet, in many ways, he remained the same man he had always been. He still lived modestly, at least by the standards of the super-rich. His home in Cleveland, a brownstone on Euclid Avenue, in what was then called Millionaire's Row, was comfortable, but not ostentatious. He didn't collect art or race horses or maintain a fleet of yachts. His pleasures were simple: time with his family, his Baptist church, the gardens he cultivated at his country estate. He still dressed conservatively, in dark suits and modest accessories. He still spoke softly, almost inaudibly at times, forcing listeners to lean in close to hear him. He still maintained the mask of unflappable calm that had served him so well in negotiations, never raising his voice, never losing his temper, never giving anything away. He still kept meticulous records. Every transaction, every decision, every piece of correspondence was documented and filed. Standard Oil's headquarters generated mountains of paper reports from field offices, financial statements, competitive intelligence, strategic analyses. Rockefeller read it all, or at least he read summaries prepared by his subordinates. Nothing escaped his attention, and he still worked with the same relentless focus that had characterized his career from the beginning. His days followed a strict routine: breakfast with the family, prayers, then work, meetings with trustees and executives, reviews of operations and finances, correspondence, planning, more meetings. He rarely took vacations. He rarely relaxed. He was a machine designed for a single purpose, and that purpose was the growth and protection of Standard Oil. His management style was unusual for the era: collaborative rather than autocratic, at least among his inner circle. He listened more than he spoke. He encouraged debate and welcomed dissenting opinions, though he always made the final decisions himself. He delegated authority to trusted lieutenants, giving them wide latitude to run their respective operations as long as they met their targets. But beneath the surface collegiality, there was no question about who was in charge. Rockefeller's word was law. His disapproval, expressed through a raised eyebrow or a quiet word, was more devastating than another man's rage. Executives who failed him were quietly removed. Those who succeeded were rewarded lavishly, not just with money, but with trust certificates that made them partners in the enterprise. This combination of decentralized operations and centralized control was one of Standard Oil's great innovations. The trust was too large for any one man to manage directly. It operated in too many markets, employed too many people, faced too many daily decisions. Rockefeller solved this problem by creating a hierarchy of competent managers, each responsible for a specific area, all reporting ultimately to the trustees in New York. It was, in a sense, the first modern corporation, the template that every major company in the 20th century would follow. The holding company structure, the divisional organization, the separation of strategic and operational management, all of these innovations can be traced back to the Standard Oil Trust. Of course, Rockefeller didn't invent these techniques for the benefit of management theorists. He invented them because they worked. They allowed him to control an empire of unprecedented size and complexity. They allowed him to crush competition more efficiently than anyone had ever crushed competition before. The crushing continued throughout the 1880s, though by now there was precious little left to crush. With refining firmly under control, Standard Oil turned its attention to the other stages of the oil business. It expanded its pipeline network until it controlled virtually all the means of transporting crude from the wellheads to the refineries. It purchased oil-producing properties in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the newly discovered fields of West Virginia. It built tank cars, steamships, and storage facilities. It established a network of wholesale distributors and even began acquiring retail operations, the predecessors of today's gas stations. At every stage, the pattern was the same. Standard Oil would enter a market, assess the competition, and then methodically absorb or destroy it. Companies that cooperated were purchased at reasonable prices and integrated into the trust. Companies that resisted were subjected to the full range of Standard Oil's competitive weapons: predatory pricing, supply disruptions, transportation discrimination, and, when necessary, espionage and sabotage. Yes, sabotage. One of the most controversial aspects of Standard Oil's history involves the lengths to which the company would go to eliminate stubborn competitors. Consider the case of the Tidewater Pipeline Company. In 1879, a group of independent producers and refiners, desperate to escape Standard Oil's stranglehold on transportation, conceived an audacious plan. They would build a pipeline from the Pennsylvania oil fields directly to the Atlantic seaboard, bypassing both the railroads and Standard Oil's pipeline network entirely. The Tidewater Pipeline was a genuine engineering achievement, the first long-distance crude oil pipeline to cross a major mountain range. When it was completed in 1879, it demonstrated that Standard Oil's transportation monopoly could be broken. For a brief moment, it seemed like competition might return to the oil industry. Standard Oil responded with everything it had. First, it tried to buy the Tidewater pipeline. The owners refused. Then it tried to block the pipeline's construction through legal challenges and land purchases. These tactics slowed but didn't stop the project. Then it cut prices on its own pipeline services, trying to make Tidewater's operation unprofitable. When that didn't work, it began building its own parallel pipelines to the seaboard, flooding the market with transportation capacity. According to testimony that would later emerge in congressional investigations, Standard Oil also engaged in more direct forms of interference. Its agents were accused of bribing Tidewater employees, stealing confidential documents, and even sabotaging equipment. Whether these accusations were true or exaggerated remains disputed, but the pattern of aggressive tactics was undeniable. Eventually, Standard Oil achieved its objective through a different route. It simply bought a controlling interest in Tidewater's stock. By 1883, the pipeline that had been built to challenge Standard Oil's monopoly was effectively under Standard Oil's control. The independents who had invested their hopes and their money in the project were left with nothing. Stories like this were repeated across the industry. Independent refiners, producers, pipeline operators, and marketers who tried to compete with Standard Oil found themselves facing an opponent with seemingly unlimited resources and an absolute willingness to use them. Some sold out and joined the trust. Others were driven into bankruptcy. A few survived on the margins, too small to be worth Standard Oil's attention. By the end of the 1880s, the consolidation was essentially complete. Standard Oil controlled somewhere between 85 and 90% of the American oil industry, refining, transportation, and increasingly, production as well. It was the most complete monopoly the country had ever seen. But even as Rockefeller tightened his grip on the oil industry, the forces that would eventually challenge him were beginning to stir. The first rumblings came from the political sphere. In the aftermath of the South Improvement Company scandal, public suspicion of Standard Oil had never fully dissipated. Newspapers ran periodic exposés of the company's business practices. Politicians, particularly those from oil-producing regions, denounced the trust in fiery speeches. Farmers and small businessmen, who saw themselves as victims of railroad discrimination and monopoly power, began organizing for political action. The most significant development came in 1887, when Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. This law created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first federal regulatory agency, and gave it authority to oversee railroad rates and practices. The law was primarily aimed at railroad abuses, but it had implications for Standard Oil as well. The secret rebates and drawbacks that had been so central to Rockefeller's strategy were now, at least theoretically, illegal. Standard Oil adapted, as it always did. It shifted from railroad transportation to pipelines, which were not covered by the new law. It restructured its rate agreements to comply with the letter of the law while violating its spirit. It used its political influence to ensure that the Interstate Commerce Commission remained weak and underfunded. But the political landscape was changing. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law specifically designed to combat monopolies and restraints of trade. The law was vaguely worded and initially ineffective. Courts interpreted it narrowly, and enforcement was sporadic, but it represented a new principle in American governance. The federal government was asserting the authority to break up private businesses that grew too powerful. Standard Oil was an obvious target. The company's dominance was so complete, its methods so notorious, that it had become a symbol of everything that critics found wrong with American capitalism. Politicians who wanted to burnish their reform credentials attacked Standard Oil in speeches. Journalists who wanted to make their reputations investigated Standard Oil's practices. Lawyers who wanted to establish new legal precedents brought suits against Standard Oil in state and federal courts. For the moment, these attacks were more annoying than threatening. Standard Oil had excellent lawyers, deep pockets, and powerful friends in Washington. It could tie up lawsuits for years, lobby against unfavorable legislation, and weather public criticism with equanimity. Rockefeller himself remained serene, confident that the company's size and efficiency made it essentially invulnerable. "We are not in business for our health," he told a colleague. "We are in business to make money, and we will continue to make money, regardless of what the politicians say." But the politicians were saying more and more, and soon, a new voice would join the chorus of voice that would prove more dangerous to Standard Oil than all the laws and lawsuits combined. Her name was Ida Minerva Tarbell, and she had never forgotten what Standard Oil did to her father. By the early 1890s, Tarbell had established herself as one of America's leading journalists. She had written acclaimed biographies of Napoleon and Abraham Lincoln, demonstrating both her narrative skills and her capacity for exhaustive research. She was intelligent, tenacious, and possessed of a moral certainty that bordered on the absolute. She was also looking for her next subject. The publisher of McClure's magazine, Samuel McClure, had an idea. The American public was increasingly concerned about the power of the great trust Standard Oil, the Steel Trust, the Sugar Trust. What if the magazine published a detailed, thoroughly researched history of how these monopolies had been built? What if they exposed the methods, named the names, showed the public exactly what was being done in the name of free enterprise? Tarbell was interested, and she knew exactly which trust she wanted to investigate. The series she would produce 19 installments, published between 1902 and 1904, later collected into a 2-volume book, would become one of the most influential works of journalism in American history. It would transform public opinion, galvanize the reform movement, and ultimately contribute to the destruction of the Standard Oil empire. But that was still years away. In 1890, Ida Tarbell was just beginning to gather her evidence, interview her sources, and assemble the case that would bring down the oil god. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller was doing something unexpected. He was stepping back. As Rockefeller aged, he became an increasingly curious figure in American life. The ruthless monopolist of the 1870s had become a kindly old man in a white wig, handing out dimes and dispensing advice about diet and exercise. The public's memory was short, and the man who had once been depicted as an octopus strangling the nation was now seen as a benevolent grandfather figure. He encouraged this transformation, though whether consciously or not is hard to say. He gave frequent interviews in which he discussed his philosophy of life, his health regimen, and his belief that hard work and clean living were the keys to success. He avoided discussing Standard Oil or the controversies of his business career, deflecting questions with a smile and a platitude. His daily routine was almost monastic. He rose early, ate a simple breakfast, played golf for several hours, took a nap, worked briefly on correspondence, and retired early. He was obsessive about his health, following strict dietary rules and avoiding anything he believed might be harmful. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, and avoided stress whenever possible. This discipline paid off. Despite his various health crises in middle age, Rockefeller lived to the age of 97. He outlived most of his contemporaries, most of his critics, and most of the men who had tried to bring him down. He spent his final decades at his estates in New York and Florida, surrounded by family and attended by a small army of servants and physicians. He remained mentally sharp into his 90s, following the news, managing his investments, and continuing to oversee his philanthropic activities. He never expressed regret for his business methods. When asked about the practices that had made him infamous, the rebates, the predatory pricing, the destruction of competitors, he maintained that he had done nothing wrong. The oil industry had been chaotic and wasteful, and he had brought order and efficiency. If some people had been hurt in the process, that was unfortunate but unavoidable. Progress always had costs. Did he believe this? Almost certainly. Rockefeller possessed the ability, common among the very successful, to construct a narrative in which his own interests and the public good were always aligned. In his mind, he had not exploited the oil industry, he had saved it. He had not crushed his competitors, he had absorbed them into a more efficient organization. He had not corrupted democracy, he had simply operated within the rules as he found them. Whether you accept this narrative depends on how you weigh efficiency against fairness, outcomes against methods, the benefits of monopoly against the costs. On May 23, 1937, John Davison Rockefeller died at his estate in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old and had been the richest man in America for half a century. The obituaries were respectful but conflicted. The New York Times called him the most powerful figure in American business history, while acknowledging that his methods had been the subject of bitter controversy. Other papers struck a similar balance, praising his philanthropic achievements while noting the tactics that had made them possible. He was buried in Cleveland, the city where his empire had begun, in a modest grave next to his wife Seti, who had died in 1915. The funeral was simple, as he had requested. There were no speeches, no eulogies, no public tributes, just prayers, hymns, and silence. His estate was valued at approximately $26 million at the time of his death, a fraction of his peak wealth. The rest had been given away, to the Rockefeller Foundation, to the University of Chicago, to medical research institutions, to causes and organizations that continue to operate to this day. His descendants continued his philanthropic work. The Rockefeller family remains one of the most prominent in American philanthropy, and the foundations and institutions created with Rockefeller money continue to shape the world more than a century after his death. So what do we make of John D. Rockefeller? He was, without question, the most successful businessman in American history. No one before or since has achieved such complete dominance over a major industry. Standard Oil's market share, 90% at its peak, has never been matched. Rockefeller's wealth, adjusted for the size of the economy, has never been equaled. He was also one of history's greatest philanthropists. The money he gave away, over $500 million during his lifetime, worth perhaps $10 billion today, funded institutions and initiatives that have saved millions of lives and advanced human knowledge immeasurably. But he was also a man who built his fortune through methods that, even in his own time, were considered brutal. He crushed competitors without mercy. He colluded with railroads to gain unfair advantages. He used his power to shape markets, manipulate prices, and eliminate choice. He corrupted the political process and evaded the law. How do we reconcile these different aspects of the same man? One approach is to simply accept the contradiction. Human beings are complex, and the same person can be capable of both great good and great harm. Rockefeller was a devout Baptist who believed genuinely in charity and the improvement of mankind. He was also a cold-blooded businessman who would destroy anyone who stood in his way. Both of these things were true at the same time. Another approach is to look at the context. The Gilded Age was a period of minimal regulation, when the line between legal and illegal business practices was often unclear. Many of the tactics that Standard Oil employed, railroad rebates, predatory pricing, vertical integration, were legal at the time, even if they seem outrageous today. Rockefeller was playing by the rules of his era, even as he was helping to write those rules. A third approach is to weigh the costs and benefits. Standard Oil's monopoly eliminated competition and concentrated economic power in dangerous ways. But it also brought order to a chaotic industry, lowered prices for consumers, and built the infrastructure that would power the 20th century. The Rockefeller philanthropies, funded by monopoly profits, have done incalculable good. Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Different people will reach different conclusions. Perhaps the most honest answer is that Rockefeller represents something fundamental about American capitalism itself: its capacity for both creation and destruction, for both innovation and exploitation. He embodied the promise of the American dream, the idea that a poor boy from rural New York could become the richest man in the world through intelligence and hard work. But he also embodied its shadow, the concentration of power, the corruption of politics, the ruthless pursuit of profit at the expense of everything else. There is one more thing worth considering. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, more than a century ago. The antitrust laws that were strengthened in its wake have shaped American business ever since. The regulatory state that emerged from the progressive era has expanded and evolved, creating layers of oversight that Rockefeller never faced. And yet, look at the technology giants of our own era, the companies that dominate search, social media, cloud computing, and e-commerce. Look at their market shares, their competitive tactics, their political influence. Look at the way they acquire potential rivals before they can become threats, the way they use their platforms to advantage their own products, the way they shape the rules of the game. Does any of this sound familiar? John D. Rockefeller has been dead for nearly 90 years, but the questions his career raised are as relevant as ever. How much economic power should any single company be allowed to accumulate? What tactics should be permitted in the pursuit of competitive advantage? How do we balance the benefits of scale and efficiency against the dangers of monopoly? How do we prevent private wealth from corrupting public institutions? We are still arguing about these questions, still trying to find the right balance between competition and consolidation, between the dynamism of markets and the stability of regulation. The ghost of Standard Oil haunts these debates, a reminder that we have faced these challenges before and that the answers are never simple. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about John D. Rockefeller is not what he did, but what he revealed. He revealed that the free market, left entirely to its own devices, tends toward monopoly. Without intervention, the strong will devour the weak until only one player remains. This is not a failure of capitalism. It is, in a sense, capitalism working exactly as designed. Competition is supposed to produce winners, and winners are supposed to win. He revealed that concentrated economic power inevitably seeks political power. Standard Oil didn't just want to dominate the oil industry, it wanted to shape the laws and regulations that govern that industry. It bought politicians, influenced judges, and manipulated public opinion. This too is not an aberration, but a pattern that recurs throughout history. He revealed that philanthropy, however generous, cannot compensate for the harms that make it possible. Rockefeller gave away hundreds of millions of dollars, and the good he did with that money was real and substantial. But the money came from somewhere. It came from the competitors he destroyed, the workers he exploited, the communities he dominated. Charity is not justice. And finally, he revealed something about the American character, about our admiration for success, our tolerance for ruthlessness, our belief that winners deserve their winnings regardless of how they won. We celebrate entrepreneurs and innovators, even when their innovations come at tremendous social cost. We build statues to captains of industry while the workers who made their fortunes possible are forgotten. John D. Rockefeller was the product of a particular time and place, but he was also something more. He was a mirror held up to American society, reflecting back our values, our contradictions, and our choices. What we see in that mirror depends on what we are looking for. Let's return to where we started, the Supreme Court, 1911, and the moment when the most powerful company in American history was ordered to destroy itself. On the surface, it looked like justice. The monopoly had been broken. The trust had been dissolved. The power that Rockefeller had accumulated over 40 years had been shattered into 34 pieces. But look closer. The pieces were still owned by the same people. The executives who had run Standard Oil were now running its successor companies, The infrastructure, the refineries, the pipelines, the ships, the storage tanks remained intact. The expertise, the relationships, the institutional knowledge, all of it survived the dissolution. And John D. Rockefeller, sitting on his golf course as the news arrived, understood immediately what the court could not, that the breakup was not a defeat, but a liberation. Freed from the constraints of a single corporate structure, the successor companies would compete with each other, innovate, expand into new markets. Their combined value would soon exceed anything Standard Oil had ever been worth. The oil god had been broken, and in breaking, had only become more powerful. This is perhaps the ultimate lesson of the Rockefeller story. Power, once accumulated, is extraordinarily difficult to destroy. It can be dispersed, transformed, hidden, but it does not simply disappear. The wealth that Rockefeller amassed continues to shape the world more than a century after his death. The companies that emerged from Standard Oil's dissolution, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP America, remain among the largest and most powerful corporations on Earth. The philanthropic institutions he created continue to influence education, medicine, and public policy. In a very real sense, we still live in John D. Rockefeller's world. The cars we drive run on gasoline refined by processes his company perfected. The universities we attend were shaped by his model of organized philanthropy. The regulatory framework that governs our economy was created, in large part, as a response to the threat he represented. He wanted to bring order to chaos, to replace the waste of competition with the efficiency of monopoly. In this, he succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. He created a template for corporate organization that every major company would follow. He demonstrated what was possible when capital, expertise, and ambition were combined without limit. But he also demonstrated the costs. The competitors crushed, the communities dominated, the democracy corrupted, the alternatives foreclosed. These too are part of his legacy, inscribed in the historical record for anyone who cares to look. Was John D. Rockefeller a villain or a visionary, a robber baron or a benefactor of mankind? The answer depends on where you stand, what you value, and whose story you choose to tell. But perhaps the question itself is wrong. Perhaps the point is not to render a verdict on Rockefeller, but to understand what he represents and to ask ourselves whether we want to live in the world he helped create. The oil still flows. The money still accumulates. The power still concentrates. The questions remain. And somewhere, John D. Rockefeller is still handing out dimes, smiling his thin smile, and waiting for history to decide.